Hello everyone. Welcome to the recorded presentation of my honors research project, and thank you for taking the time to watch. Because this is essentially a presentation of a paper, this video will partially consist of me talking to you directly, like this, about the process and my thoughts, and also make use of slides to help visualize and articulate some of the content of the paper itself. I will be working from some notes as well, so please give me a little grace with that, and I hope you enjoy hearing about this research. As my advisors for this project would tell you, I had multiple ideas throughout the planning stages of this honors research project, none of which I was completely satisfied with. Last semester, however, I began to think about my work in the theater department and some of the discussions that we've had in class about the role and responsibilities of a Christian theater artist. I developed those thoughts into the project that this has become today. So let's get started. Critiques of theater in the Western tradition date back earlier than the first theory and advocacy of theater. Aristotle's Poetics, a work which lays out this first theory, is widely considered a response to the criticism of poetry by his tutor Plato. The Christian church drew on the Platonic concepts of imitation when faced with the Roman practice of theater, and the resulting condemnation for the stage has left a mark on various Christian traditions, including some today. My research aims to help understand the background of some of these historical critiques of theater and address them with thoughtful propositions on how we can pursue theater as Christian artists. Before getting into the details, I want to clarify what my work does not attempt to do. This essay is not a justification of theater's very existence or simply a counter-argument to all of these claims that we will look at. Not only has this already been done for each argument, it is clear that the theater world does not need my justification in order to exist and to keep practicing theater. This essay does not attempt to look at every possible accusation that has been made against theater. Again, this kind of exhaustive survey has been done before, probably in many cases, but most importantly for me, by Jonas Barish in his book, The Antitheatrical Prejudice. This book is essentially a survey of the entire history of anti-theatrical arguments and some of the answers that have been made to those. It has been extremely useful as a reference for and commentary on many of the sources I examined here, but my focus is very different from Barish's. What I will attempt to do is look at three important issues brought against theater and find responses from theater advocates that help us see how we can approach the art of theater with principle and intentionality to give glory to God. These three issues will be presented within the frame of the stasis questions of rhetorical theory. First conceived in ancient Greece, these questions are those of fact, definition, quality, and policy. I have three main issues that fit into the last three of these four questions, but the theory behind these questions is that it is necessary to progress from one place of argument to the next. You cannot create a policy until you establish the qualities of the issue. You cannot evaluate the quality of something until you have defined it, and you cannot have an argument over definition until you have agreed upon and established what the facts are. With this concept in mind, and my thanks for sticking with me through the introduction, we will begin our analysis by looking at definition. The roots of any anti-theatrical argument reach back to Plato's thoughts on imitation. In his work, The Republic, Plato excludes poets from his imagining of the ideal state. Here I'll make a brief aside to note that in many historical contexts, the term poetry is largely equivalent to our modern use of the word theater. When this occurs, I will use poetry and theater interchangeably in the hopes that you don't hear the term poetry as the same practice of writing poems that we have today. So, Plato gives several reasons for his suspicion of imitation in poetry. He first brings it up when talking about education, and points to the stories from Homer and other poets that were taught as a form of education in ancient Greece. Plato is unhappy with how an erroneous representation is made of the nature of gods and heroes, portraying them as imperfect, doing sinful things like sleeping with mortals or scheming against other in the myths that I'm sure most of us are familiar with. Plato says it is harmful to show the gods doing these things because we look up to them and will therefore imitate their example. On this question of imitation, Plato's student, Aristotle, writes later in his Poetics about the origin and purpose of poetry, stating that imitation comes from two motives, to entertain and to instruct. Aristotle even goes so far as to say that we enjoy watching theater because we learn from it. Aristotle sees this imitation as natural and wholesome rather than harmful. Now, Like I said before, Plato has several issues with theater. His most thorough argument comes in Book 10 of the Republic, concerning the very nature of imitation. Here Plato articulates his famous theory of forms with the example of a bed. There is one ideal concept in nature of a bed, and when a carpenter makes a bed, he is imitating that idea. Obviously, all sorts of beds can be made, and they will all be different imitations of one idea. Now, if a painter paints a picture of the bed that the carpenter made, this is an imitation of an imitation, and this is unacceptable for Plato. He says it is thrice removed from the truth, and essentially says that all such imitation is inherently deceptive, and all imitators, he is mainly aiming at poets or theater artists, are incapable of telling the truth. There are a few holes in Plato's logic, but one that we'll look at was addressed by Neoplatonist Sir Philip Sidney, who was an Elizabethan statesman and Renaissance poet. Sidney wrote a book called A Defense of Poesy, and he argues that poetry is the superior form of instruction because it is an imitation of the ideals of nature. Here he takes Plato's theory of forms and simply makes the jump to imitating the ideal form rather than imitating an imitation. Through this new argument, Sidney says that theater and other forms of imitation cannot be lying because they are not pretending to tell the truth in the first place. He points to examples of parables in the Bible and fables from classical authors like Aesop as examples of finding truth through fiction. As he writes, this imitation is not laboring to tell you what is or is not, but what should or should not be. Sidney also articulates an advocacy for theater on similar terms to Aristotle's theory of instruction and delight. He does warn against certain improper practices of theater, like combining elements from comedy and tragedy solely for the purposes of pleasure, but argues that when the goal is pleasurable instruction, theater is the highest pursuit of truth. So, we have worked to define theater as truth rather than lies, and we will now move on to determine its quality, that is, to answer questions like, is it good or bad? In this case, we'll be specifically looking at the value of theater, and whether it is a waste of time and money. This is one of the main charges that has been brought against the theater by the church. St. John Chrysostom was a prolific and formative writer and leader of the 4th century church, and he consistently reminded his congregations that God has given you a limited period of life to serve him, and that squandering this time on entertainment and theater is a complete loss when you ought to spend your entire life in prayers and supplications. We would be mistaken to take these sermons out of the context of the extreme spectacles that were taking place on the Roman stage at the time. The Roman theater practice drifted much further toward pure pleasure, with gladiatorial events and sexual acts presented in extreme reality. Jonas Barish, in this book, theorizes that this was because the Roman theater was not tightly tied to religion as the Greek theater was. He writes that the licentiousness present there was a major reason for the church's opposition, and he discusses two of the earliest writers, Tatian and Tertullian. Both of these church fathers were extreme ascetics. They feared or avoided any sort of pleasure, and Tertullian insisted that the spectacles belonged to the devil and his pomp and his angels because of the idolatry involved. This severity undoubtedly influenced Chrysostom, who also referred to theater events as Satan's pomps. Barish sees this teaching as the fathers displaying a need to safeguard the very survival of the faith. And the vehemence with which the church fought the depravity of that current theater suggests that the stakes were indeed extremely high. But while this aversion to Roman theater and the view that it was an extreme waste is certainly understandable, we cannot just leave the argument there if we are to find a way to apply this to our own theater artistry. Chrysostom's proposition of prayer and supplications as our sole pursuit doesn't leave us with room to utilize our gifts. The idea that there are always more useful things to do than theater, like prayer, continued to be a line of attack from the church. Sidney again offers a counter to this argument, pointing out that it is a fallacy to say that good is not good because better is better. However, his argument doesn't address larger questions of morality or aspects of faith. In 1642, however, Sir Richard Baker, a politician and religious writer in England, wrote a lengthy response to the most common arguments against theater in his book, The Theater Vindicated. Baker says that while sermons and prayer are undoubtedly desirable forms of instruction, they do not offer us the same insight that theater does. There is no comparison to be made because they are in different categories. A pulpit may teach us to know ourselves, but it cannot show us to see ourselves. This is only done by representation, which is the proper office and work of plays. He even quotes Thomas Aquinas, one of the most respected minds in church history, to say that plays draw people into truth better than any means of reasoning with them can. German philosopher and playwright Friedrich Schiller also wrote in 1784 that pleasure is necessary for humans to find balance in life, so we must look for ways to accomplish instruction in a pleasing way. Contemporary philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff writes that art is inherently part of the physical, created world that God gave to us, and that the artist who sees life and reality as a Christian will not despise the creation in which he finds himself. The art of theater is indeed an undeniably powerful one, and we cannot reject this gift as if it isn't part of the creation that we live in. We can make it valuable, make it worth the time we spend on it to teach and share truth with one another. So, we have considered the qualities of theater, and now we must apply them to a policy. What should we do? Here, I want to take a closer look at what exactly theater does, because knowing its effects will necessarily be part of knowing how to utilize them. Plato's warning against poetry includes a cynical prognosis that all imitative theater results in harm to our emotional state. He finds hypocrisy in the fact that society values rationality and calm rather than the expression of emotions, which we view as weakness. But then, on the stage, we find delight in seeing those same emotions portrayed openly, and even feeling them ourselves. Aristotle describes this effect with his concept of catharsis, the purging of emotion, and says that rather than inflaming weak emotions, theater essentially gets them out of our system so that we can continue functioning rationally. However, it is Plato's view of these emotions as dangerous that has a lasting effect on the Christian church. The sensual characteristics of the Roman theater seem to bear out Plato's view of overindulgence. St. Augustine, a powerful voice in the early church and still today, had an early life of hedonism and interaction with the Roman stage that provided a personal background from which he formed his views on theater. Augustine remembers theaters that were full of images of my own miseries and kindled the fire within me, and, similarly to Plato, questions why this misery is desirable to audiences. He sees this emotion as shallow and inauthentic, finding no true usefulness in it. Arguments have also been made that theater's economic dependence on the audience is a cause for immorality. Actors will do anything to keep the audiences, their source of income, coming back. John Witherspoon, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and president of Princeton College, writes in his book, A Serious Inquiry into the Nature and Effects of the Stage, that the effect of theater is inseparable from human nature. At our base level, we want pleasure, and a theater could not be well regulated and moral, because if it were, and human nature to continue in its present state, the doors of the playhouse would shut of their own accord, because nobody would demand access. The theater of pleasure does not serve God or his church then, and theater without an audience does not survive. Contemporary philosopher Calvin Searveld offers a new perspective. He writes that Christians have often thought that while spiritual guidance and physical sustenance are necessary, we do not truly need art to survive. But he argues that we should not limit what elements of culture we take part in, because areas untouched by a biblically redeeming consciousness and formation really go to hell. To enable the development of Christian art, Searveld calls on the entire church, saying, while not every believer needs to specialize in art, every believer does need to support its ongoing Christian production. For Searveld, to both serve Christ and thrive in doing good work, an artist needs the support of the entire Christian community. This is an encouraging perspective for theater audiences. On the role of the artist themselves, Searveld writes in a later book that God gave us artistry to open us up to nuances in the creation, to tickle our neighbor's fancy redemptively, to focus attention on things you never imagined existed. The artist's task is not simply to please in a more Christian manner or reiterate sermon points, but to reveal the gifts in the world that God has given us in a deeper way. Art philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff reaffirms this pursuit of art as a God-given task, one that is inherently tied to our physical world. A human's vocation, he says, is to be the world's gardener, with the goal of dwelling in shalom, in peace. question of how to pursue theater as a Christian artist is not a simple one. It has many parts, and it doesn't fit with any one answer. If we are to pursue an understanding of human truth through theater, we must be willing to constantly question our assumptions, our approach, and our work, rather than presume we have arrived at a final conclusion. This is a failing of many of the theorists analyzed in this research. Plato banned poets entirely from his ideal society. Early church fathers condemned theater unequivocally, and later, leaders like John Witherspoon were adamant that Christians must be completely separate from the theater. Sidney is an example of advocacy edging on hyperbole, with his insistence that poetry is the ultimate and perfect form of instruction. Without openness to the possibility of change, no healthy practice can be established. With that openness in mind, we can take in arguments from multiple points of view and integrate them into our approach to theater. We can address Plato's fear of false images and harmful examples by admitting our own faults and being ever vigilant that as we question and explore with our art, we do so truthfully. In a similar manner, we can take warnings from the Church Fathers seriously concerning sensuality and pleasure for its own sake, and be wary of indulgence as we search for meaning in Christ's world. We can acknowledge that theater has often been pushed to the dirty edges of society, acknowledge that this has sometimes made it a place of brokenness and pain, and we can work to redeem that community as a blessing for both the marginalized and the accepted. Thus concludes my essay. The final piece of my project was to create a manifesto that articulates the Christian theater ethic that comes out of this conclusion. Manifestos have a rich and fascinating history as documents that express a vision and tell a story in a very theatrical way. With the following manifesto, I hope to declare to the public my vision for the Christian theater artist. Regardless of past examples, the theater is capable of being a powerful tool for the discovery and advocacy of truth. Imitating evil or perversion with humor or favor makes us poets that Plato despises, so we must imitate the world as it truthfully is. A Christian has a duty to search out the truth throughout God's creation. Thus, the Christian theater artist must use their gifts to this end. This means that the Christian theater artist is not ashamed of their craft and its place in God's plan of redemption, is committed to excellence in artistry by multiple standards, to steward well their God-given talents, is committed to truth in order to represent well the righteousness of God, is careful in their creative work, never assuming that they have arrived at perfection in art or truth, is collaborative, understanding that the work and voices of other artists are a reflection of the body of Christ, participates in the artistic community beyond their own contributions, does not ever create theater for purposeless pleasure. We must not take our work lightly, but instead work toward the goal of transforming the world into the kingdom of Christ. We must understand the legacy that we have inherited, the brokenness that is both a cause and a result of theater's reputation of wretchedness. Let us embrace the opportunity that this gives us to welcome people without expectations. That's all for my presentation. Thanks for sticking through it. If you have questions about any part of my essay, the process, or anything else, comment below or shoot me an email at lucas.sander@nwciowa.edu. If you're watching this after May 7th, 2020, you can check the description below for a link to the full essay and the manifesto. Thanks again for watching.